That Triathlon Show, episode 59. Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. As always, I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode, I talk about stride and running with power together with Chris Hague, who is a fellow stride user and a triathlon coach. And he uses it a lot in his training and is one of the most active members of the Stride Community Users Facebook group, which we mentioned several times in this chat or Stride riffing session or whatever you want to call it. So I highly recommend that after you listen to this interview, you join that Facebook group, regardless of whether you're using Stride or not, because there's so much that can be learned from that. And also, we talk about some numbers and formulas and technical things at some points in this interview, but there will be a Google Sheet linked up in the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com that you can download and use for yourself. Not download, you make a copy in your Google Drive, technically. So anyway, that will be easy enough for you to do, and then you can just plug in the numbers that Stride shows you after you run with Stride, and it will automatically calculate these more advanced metrics for you. So those are just some things that I wanted to mention before we start the interview. But now let's go and hang out with Chris Hague. All right, it's my great pleasure to welcome Chris Hague to That Triathlon Show. How are you today, Chris?
I'm doing great. It's thank you very much for having me on. I've been a listener since episode 1, actually, so it's an honor to be on your show.
Yeah, and you've been sending in questions and stuff both for the podcast and on the email list, so it's been great connecting with you. And I also, before I started my podcast, I had heard you on Kevin Koskala's podcast, Try Swim Coach, which you have been doing some work on. So we have been doing overlapping things for quite some time. So great to finally connect for sure. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days mostly?
Sure. Right now, I'm actually just started school for sports psychology at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. So that's my current focus, academically at least. And then physically, I have a running background, so I've been focusing on running for the past, I think, 6 months, but also like to dabble in multi-sports, so long-distance triathlon and duathlon.
Perfect. And you are one of the most active members in the Stride Running Community Facebook group, which is today's topic, Stride and Running with Power. And it was, I don't even remember, how did we come up with, I think we just started talking about how to maybe measure the impact of strength training on the Run with Power outfit, and then I just said that hey, that we should do a podcast episode together, because I've been getting a lot of questions about that. And can you define for the listeners what Running with Power is, just very briefly?
So Running with Power, I refrained from saying that it's exactly like biking with power, because it's not. But in essence, a watt is a watt, and it's essentially evaluating how much work you are doing while you are running, and objectively doing so. So instead of just giving a very vague how much work are you doing, it's saying, it's quantifying it by giving it an exact number.
So it's kind of like biking in that, for example, if you go uphill, you won't go as fast, but you will still be doing a lot of work, and you can measure that with a running power meter, like Stride, for example. But when you say that it's not exactly like bike power meters, what are the differences?
So when you're thinking about a bike power meter, you have strain gauges in the crank arm, or you have a crank arm that has algorithms that calculates a power number. But because you have less forces acting upon you on a bike, the higher the number, the better. Because if you put out more power, you're going to go faster. That's not always the case with running. So on the bike, if you have a higher FTP, that's fantastic. If your power to weight ratio is, high, that's good. And you always are working at trying to improve those numbers on the bike. With running though, you have something if you increase your numbers, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going faster. So you could be doing an all-out sprint and really pushing your power numbers up, but if those extra watts that you're pushing aren't going to pushing you forward, but instead, pushing you from side to side or up and down, so laterally and horizontally, then that's wasted watts. So that's the biggest difference, is that not all of your power when running is going to pushing you forward.
Yeah, I have a perfect example of this. Comparing a triathlon run with an open running race. I've at least seen when I've been doing triathlon 10Ks and an open 10Ks that I can produce more power in the triathlon 10K, and even if I go all out for the open 10K, which seems great. But actually, I've had the same times, which is kind of unusual, though. I was running pretty slow in that open 10K race, but still I was running just as fast, but with much lower power in that open 10K without a bike and a swim before that. The reason being that more energy was going to waste on that triathlon run.
And I think that's a major hiccup that people get when they start using running with power, is that when they do their first run test and then they train, hard for 10 to 12 weeks and then do another power test, and they see that their FTP went down, but their critical pace went up, then they're confused. But what that means is that your more of your power is going to pushing you forward rather than wasted energy.
Yes, exactly. Let's talk a little bit about Stride first, which is the power meter that both of us use. So what is Stride? How does it work?
So Stride, they started out with like a heart rate strap type power meter that measured your algorithms. And I think that was called the Pioneer. But then they recently created a footpod, I think, starting middle of last year. And what it does is, it's not a power meter in the sense of strain gauges. They don't have any strain gauges in your shoe. But what it does is it's a very high-tech accelerometer. It takes your accelerometer reading, so how quickly you're turning over, bouncing, etc., and then it also coordinates that with where you are altitude-wise, so it can measure, hills and everything, and then it computes all of that data into computing your power. And they've done validity studies using force plates on this, so it's a quite accurate measurement.
Yeah, you need your weight as input as well for it to accurately calculate your power. But other than that, that's exactly how it does it. And it's important to mention also that it has those accelerometers in 3 dimensions, because some other power meters don't have that 3D power measurement, and both are fine, because the lateral power can, in many cases, it's not as big a waste of energy as the vertical power, but you just need to know that you can't compare apples to oranges, which comparing 2D and 3D power meters would be. So going back a bit to the difference between run power meters and bike power meters, one topic that I want to discuss: running zones, and what is the difference between running power zones and bike power zones?
So with running power zones, I find that you have to be more, they're higher. So when we're talking about zone 1 and zone 2, your easy, casual, all-day endurance ride. On the bike, I find that that's between 68% to even 75% of your FTP. So if you just go out and you're noodling around with your friends, you're stopping at a coffee ride, that's about 68 to 75% of your FTP. While running, though, it's going to be higher. So I find that you should be running, if you're running a zone 2 run, you should be running about 78%, 76 to 78% of your FTP. So it's significantly higher when you're running compared to when you're biking. And the reason for that is, as we discussed, part of the wattage is going to pushing you in different directions besides forwards. So you're wasting watts, so to speak, which is adding to the total number. And part of that, another level of that zone is that that gray zone that we talk about. Well, in cycling, it's between 88 to 90%, 88 to 95%, that sweet spot. If you're doing most of your runs in that zone, it's considered the gray zone. In running, it's more around 82 to 88%. So another difference is that I find that it depends on the coach you're working with, but there's a lot of different zones for different specific types of pacing. So with running zones, I like to break it up where you have your zone 1, which is, your recovery walking when you're doing hard intervals. And that I find is between about 74 to 78%. And another big difference is when you're cycling, you can do 50 to 60% of your FTP as a recovery. If you try to do 50 to 60% of your FTP running, you'll be walking. It's very difficult to hold your form effectively when you dip under that 73, 72% of your FTP. So that kind of, for most coaches, that 74 to 76, 77%, that's kind of your zone, your recovery zone, your walking zone. And then you have your 78 to 80%, that's going to be your zone 2. That's going to be the most of your foundation runs that you're doing in that low intensity zone. And then 80 to 82, I would say, is your long distance zone. And you'd really on those easy, so your long run zones. And you could even argue for some inexperienced runner, that's going to be your marathon pacing zones. And then after you get over to 82, those are more your specific tempo. And that's what most would consider your gray zone. And then for tempo, it's more like 90 to 95%. And then above that, when you have like 95 to 105% of your critical power in your your FTP while running, that's going to be your 10K pace. And then above that, you get into, your 5K and your sprints and your repetitions.
Yeah, and about the gray zone, just to make it clear for listeners, because we've been talking about training zones in past episodes, there is a time and place to train that as well, even though it is, as Chris said, often referred to as a gray zone, and that is if you're racing a race, that where that is your race pace, so training at the specific pace that your race will be done at. So it doesn't mean that you should never do that kind of training, definitely not. One more thing that I was thinking about here with these zones is that you mentioned here going up to, well, you mentioned actually many different percentage steps, and that's really good. We'll include those on the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com. But one thing that I've been thinking about and kind of investigating a little bit is the difference between the Training Peaks power running with power zones that are based on Jim Vance's work in his book Run with Power, and then the zones in Stride's own Power Center, which is a 5-zone system, and Jim Vance has a 7-zone or 6 or 7-zone system. So do you have what's your opinion on those different ways to divide into zones your power output?
I find Stride's Power Center zones, the 5-based one, I find them very general. And not very specific, which I have a problem with. So when they say zone 1, that goes all the way up to 80% of your FTP. So when a lot of people see, zone 1, those are your powers for zone 1, and these are your powers for zone 2, and in the Power Center, zone 2 is defined as about 81% all the way up to 90%. And when people say that they should be, when they traditionally have a quote-unquote zone 2 run, and they try to run in that zone 2 according to Power Center, it's at a higher intensity than they should be running. So I find that the power zones in Power Center, which is Stride's platform, those too vague and not specific enough for the average runner. With Jim Vance's in Training Peaks, though, it's a lot more specific as recovery/walking, and then your endurance zone, and then your tempo zone, your threshold zone. So I prefer the ones in Training Peaks compared to the ones in Power Center because of the specificity.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. There is one thing, though, that I think is that I don't agree with Training Peaks. That is how they calculate the running stress score. And again, we will make a lot of references to previous episodes. For this one, episode 39, in which I talked about Training Peaks in detail. But now that you have running power meters, you can calculate your training stress score for running based on that power, obviously. And in Training Peaks, you do that kind of like you do cycling. And I think that there's a constant that they maybe should consider reconfiguring, because I believe that the running stress score that you get from Training Peaks based on running with power are they're too low for high intensity work and too high for low intensity work. Whereas in Stride's Power Center, the running stress score that they seem to have more of a polarized running stress score that I think more accurately corresponds to what you actually been doing in your training. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, if you look at the formulas for the TSS, so training stress score in Training Peaks, and the RSS, the running stress score in Stride's Power Center, they have two different formulas. Similar because they're based off intensity and your normalized power, but the major difference is that the intensity, the RSS, so talking about Stride's metric, is put to the power of K, which is a constant, which incorporates the load on the body. That you're putting yourself under when you are running. So because running is more aggressive than cycling, you have to accommodate for that within your training stress score. And that's what the RSS does. So one thing that I found doing is that what I do is once Stride's Power Center gives me an RSS number after my runs and it gets uploaded, I take that RSS number and just copy and paste it into the TSS place in Training Peaks to get a more accurate measure. And like you said, when you're going at lower intensities, that TSS and RSS, there will be a higher discrepancy between the two numbers. As you get closer to your critical power, they'll start to become more aligned.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's a great point, and I actually saw your post in the Facebook group on that, and that is part of the reason that I brought that up, because I think that's a great way to do it if you use TSS a lot in Training Peaks to actually grab that RSS from Power Center and manually replace Training Peaks TSS with that. Just a quick note here for listeners that aren't that interested in Training Peaks and the technical stuff. We will be soon getting into some more applicable things maybe for you, like pacing and how to do workouts based on power. I just want to talk about one more thing here with Training Peaks and TSS and RSS, and that is the implications in training plans, workouts, and pacing of having that RSS or RTSS now with running with power.
So because you have this new metric and you're able to more accurately measure your stress instead of using, I think, what Training Peaks did before, which was use your pace versus your critical pace, and then calculated your RTSS or your running TSS from that. Now that you have a more accurate measure of intensity with your Stride, you can map your ATP, your annual training plan, will be far more accurate than if you simply used running paces. So you're able to map out weeks based off a more accurate TSS compared to you trying to use paces on the run. Because instead of going for trying to do paces and distances at specific paces to stimulate a stress, you can just switch over and do durations at a specific power and derive a TSS score from that, which it's a novel idea. So it's moving away from the idea of, doing mile repeats, and instead of doing mile repeats, you're doing 6-minute repeats at a specific power, which flips traditional running programming on its head. And I find that interesting because that's in essence what we've been doing on, bike trainers and bike turbos, for the past couple of years, is instead of measuring it by distance, your distance and wattage, now we're measuring it by time and wattage, and distance doesn't really matter as long as you're holding that specific wattage. Meaning we can take pacing work and take it off the track, because that's a controlled environment, and put it onto the roads. So as long as you're holding a specific power for a specific time, you could be doing that on a hill, you could be doing that on the flats, you could be doing that on an undulating course, but it's the same watts, which is I find exciting.
Yeah, and I think the more hilly routes you run in your day-to-day training, the more important this difference will be now that you have running with power and getting, because that's where you will really start to see differences. Because even though Training Peaks actually, for their RTSS based on pace, they used normalized graded pace, I don't consider that very accurate, to be honest. And either way, it cancels out when you run downhill, and running downhill causes a tremendous amount of stress on the body. So that's I think it's incorrect. So this running with power now is a much better way to get an accurate handle of what you're actually putting on your body in terms of stress. So yeah, I agree with that. Do you have anything else to mention on these more technical sides on training peaks and zones and so on? Or shall we move on to things like pacing? Because that's something that I think is probably one of the most important things that we want the listeners to take away from this episode.
Yeah, so I think that's actually a perfect going off those that. Flipping it to duration and power, I think that leads perfectly into pacing. So going into pacing with power, because it's an issue, especially in triathlon, how hard should you be running off the bike? And for a long while, coaches have been saying, using rate of perceived exertion, have been trying to use heart rate and trying to use pace to pace yourself off the bike. And that offers a wide variety of problems, because if you hop off the bike and your heart rate's through the roof, well, that could also be because you're dehydrated. That also could be energy. That could be a whole range of how much caffeine you had on the bike. It could be a whole range of things that leads to an inaccurate heart rate number. Or you find that your heart rate monitor is malfunctioning. So it's really hard to pace, especially in Ironman and half Ironman, using heart rate. Same thing with pace. Depending on how hard you pushed on the bike, how hilly the course is, you can't really get an accurate pace running off the bike. So if you're running a 70.3 like St. George, your first 5 miles are all uphill. So how are you supposed to get an accurate pace there? This is where power really comes into play, because instead of trying to go for those subjective fluctuating measures like heart rate and pace, you have a constant number that you can hold on to. And that's where you can get a more accurate pacing measure.
Definitely, I agree. And one thing that I'll add to that as well is that I think there will always be a massive place in triathlon, bigger than for any gadget out there, for being able to pace, whether it's a bike, swim, or run, based on RPE, rating of perceived exertion, and being very in tune with your body. But I think power is the best way to learn to get in tune with your body, because you can actually learn to feel what a certain output feels like, even when the terrain changes, or you have done a bike before, which changes the way that you perceive the effort that you're putting out compared to the output, and so on. So I think that's actually, personally, I've been using Stride now since the late spring, and I've been looking at it in some races and checking my power and so on, and learning to use it, and also in training, obviously. But now, for the last couple of months or so in my races, I have really gotten into the habit and really think I perform best when I don't look at anything on my run. I just run as hard as I can, but within limits, of course. And I found that I've become so even more in tune with my body and being able to pace perfectly. And those, when I look at my pace curves, I have been pacing really perfectly in those races. And Stride has definitely been a big help in that, and especially teaching me how to pace in those hillier races, which is where I've had probably relative to the field, my best runs of all races that I've been doing. So that is one more aspect of Stride, and how you can use it in your runs in the triathlons.
Yeah, it helps you associate a feeling with a number, and it's pegging that feeling with a number that's consistent. So 320 watts is 320 watts whether you're running fresh or running off the bike, and being able to peg a feeling with like how hard it is to push, it's helpful. And then to add on to that, knowing that you can hold a specific wattage is psychologically reinforcing for the whole entire run. So knowing that you've done in practice, you've done in training a specific wattage for a specific time, you can relax and say, I can hold this number for the rest of the race because I've done it in practice. And instead of trying to say, I'm not sure if I can hold this heart rate because my heart rate's always changing, or I'm not sure if I can hold this pace because of all the hills coming up. But I do know that I can hold that power number.
Yeah, that's a great point. I definitely agree with that. And I've been, before my most recent races, always looking at what if it's a sprint triathlon that I'm doing, looking at, well, what's been my recent peak 15-minute or 20-minute power outputs that I've been doing. I don't think I get 15 minutes, so I've been looking at 20 minutes and know that, well, okay, if I can hold that for 20 minutes, then I sure as hell can hold it for 17 minutes or whatever around the 5K. And same for a 10K. I've been looking at like where would the sweet spot between a 30-minute peak power and the 60-minute peak power be. So I know that if I can just pull back on my power a little bit from that 30-minute peak power, then that's certainly something that I will be able to hold in the 10K for just a few more minutes. So,
and that's to quickly go back to Training Peaks and all the geeking data. With the power curve that is generated by WKO and also on Stride's Power Center, you can figure out your pace, your perfect pacing based off that power curve, which is a huge advantage over trying to use their heart rate or their pacing curve. So the power curve that comes along with Training Peaks and the Stride Power Center, it's a very good tool for figuring out what wattage you can hold for specific times.
Yeah, totally. All right. So what about sessions, workouts, and how do you use power in your workouts? What's your thoughts?
So I guess we could break this into two different categories of running fresh and then running off the bike. So when you're running fresh, some good workouts using power would be something like hill sprints or hill repetitions, where you're running for 90 seconds all the way up to 2 minutes and 30 seconds, trying to hold a specific power. And the reason why this is good with power is because you don't have to wait for your heart rate to come up, and you don't have to worry about pacing on a hill because you're going to be using different hills. So trying to repeat and hold a constant power going uphill, I find really effective. So doing between 6 to 10 repetitions of 1 minute all the way up to 2 minutes 30 running uphill at a good grade. I think that's a really good workout, whether you're just strictly a runner or whether you're a triathlete. So that's a good hill workout. Also doing, threshold workouts or tempo workouts. So doing 3 by 15 minutes at a specific power. So anywhere in between 90 to 95% of your FTP. That's another good workout. Or also fast finishes for long runs, where you build every 20 minutes, starting at 82% of your FTP, building all the way up to 95 or 98% of your FTP, and then for the last 5 minutes going all out to see what power you can hold for that last 5 minutes. And then another good one in kind of your build phase of training is over-under runs. So applying the bike workouts where you go over your threshold and under your threshold for sets amounts of time. You can actually do that while running with a power meter now. So you can bounce between 1 minute and 105% of FTP back down to kind of a cruise pace of 95% FTP, and bounce between the two of those. That's a really good workout. That's one of my favorites. So there's definitely those are kind of the workouts that I like when you're just running rather than running off the bike. And then when you're getting into your brick workouts, it helps with doing race simulations. So if you're focusing on a half Ironman, for example, maybe doing a 3 hour and 30-minute ride where you do a 20-minute build warm-up and then go straight into 4 by 30 minutes at 85%, which could be, for a trained cyclist, your half Ironman pace. And then after you do that in that 4 by 30 minutes on the bike, the first and third one is at a lower cadence, so targeting that 60 to 70% to fatigue the legs. And then your 2 and 4 would be good for that 2 and 4 rep would be your normal gearing, and that lower cadence work really helps with hilly courses and preparing you for hilly courses. But it's also a good way of fatiguing the legs before the run. And then hopping off the bike and doing something like 3 by 10 to 20 minutes at 85 to 95% of your FTP, where the first one you do at 85%, the second one you do at 90%, and then your third one at 95%. And then when you get back, looking at the data to see, all right, was I able to hold that 95%? And if you were able to hold that 95%, then you could most likely gauge from that you could most likely hold 90% of your FTP for that 13.1 miles. So it's a good assessment of fitness. Another extra dimension that you can add on to this when analyzing your workouts is how effective that 95% was. Because you can hold 95% of your wattage, but is your pace faster and is your running form lower? So that's another good thing to analyze when you're looking at your run data.
And I guess we should quickly, by the way, point out how you know your FTP on the run. And there are a few different tests that can be used. And personally, I've never done any of them. I just estimated based on my estimated 10K time. So that's pretty meta. But for the first triathlon, Olympic distance triathlon that I did this season, I had a certain power and the race went really well. So I just estimated that I could have held maybe even slightly higher in an open 10K. And then I used that to kind of get my estimated FTP from that. But there are specific protocols as well. So can you just quickly talk about those? And because we have a deadline of 15 minutes before I need to go to the next interview. And we still need to talk about those important efficiency and economy metrics that we get with power.
Right. So how you can calculate your FTP, as you said, there's a bunch of different ways. There's a 3-6 test where you do 3 laps all out on a track, take like a 20-minute break, and then do 6 laps all out on the track. You plug that into Power Center, and it generates a critical power pace and an FTP number. And your FTP or critical power is approximately what you can hold for the power that you can hold for 50 to 60 minutes approximately. Another way is, as you said, using a 10K result or a 5K result, and I actually find those really accurate. As far as aligning with the 3-6 test. So using previous results and then also using the 3-6 test. Many people like the 3-6 test because you don't have to you don't have to pause your training to do them. You recover quickly from them, and so you can get back to your normal training instead of having to take a couple days off to recover. Another way to do it, which is more high tech, is to use the power curve that I was talking about in WKO to get an approximation. So that's another way of doing. But those are, I guess, the 3 major ways of getting your FTP is the 3-6 test, 5K or 10K result, and then also using the WKO power curve.
Yeah, and this brings us nicely into the important metrics that we need to discuss. You have your critical power or your FTP, and then you also have your critical power per your weight, so divided by your weight in kilograms. And that is obviously essential because in running, if you're carrying excess weight, then you're going to go slower because you need to generate more power to go at the same pace as somebody who is carrying less weight. But just to give listeners an idea, then the critical power, at least for me, it's a bit higher than my bike FTP. It's at 315, I believe, at the moment on the run, and just below 300 on the bike. Is that something that you see as well?
Yeah, I think that's about average. It's mostly in well-trained triathletes. It's mostly higher than what they do on the bike. As far as power to weight goes, I think power to weight's a more accurate representation rather than focusing on a number, because if you're 200 pounds, you're obviously going to be able to generate a lot more, or it takes a lot more watts to push you forward.
Yeah.
So I think for the average, for kind of the elite group, it's the higher 4s, low 5s as far as power to weight ratio for FTP. And then it goes down from there. So mid 3s, I think would be your typical competitive recreational runner. Low 3s would be your more recreational runner.
Yeah, that seems accurate enough. Then we have running economy, and that is your speed per watt per kg.
It's actually running effectiveness.
Yeah, sorry, my mistake. So what do we use that for?
So running effectiveness, it's how much so as you said, the formula for that is your speed in meters per second over watts per kilogram, which simplifies down to kilograms over newtons. But to kind of think of it, and this was developed by Andrew Coggin. So to think about this, it's how much speed you're producing for your watts per kilogram. And what's good about the running effectiveness, and to give people perspective, when you calculate this, elite runners are usually, when they're running at FTP or critical power, they're usually around 1, and then it goes down to maybe low mid 9s on easy runs. So what running effectiveness does is, how much speed are you producing for how much watts per mass you're producing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I was reading some articles, and one good explanation that I found was that running effectiveness is essentially, it's how well you can overcome the horizontal retarding force that you encounter as a runner. So if you have a higher running effectiveness, then you are better at not having those, you have less retarding forces, or you need to apply less power to overcome those retarding forces because you are running more effectively. And yeah, those numbers are great as well. And here again, I did some calculations late last night to prepare for this episode. And again, to show the difference between running off the bike and running in an open 10K, in my last open 10K, I had exactly 1 as my running effectiveness, but in my last triathlon, I had those mid 90s. So, and even though I had sort of the exact same pace, I believe, in both races. So that again goes to show that that after you're doing a hard bike ride, then your effectiveness is slightly reduced. Anything else that we should add about running effectiveness, or should we go on to the efficiency index?
Well, one last point is I think running effectiveness is also good to compare to your RPE. So if you can, when you go out for a run and you do some intervals and you go back and you're analyzing your data and you feel like you really struggled on that last interval, if you look at the RE, you can actually figure out whether you really did struggle or whether that was mental fatigue. And Steve in the Stride Facebook group actually just posted a great article on this, looking at this specifically, where he had a runner who struggled on his last 20-minute interval in a marathon training run, and he said, I thought it was just breaking down, but when Steve looked at the data, he found that his running effectiveness had actually improved. So his form wasn't breaking down at all. It was just his mind that was fatiguing, and he was struggling to hit that running effectiveness. So it's an interesting correlation between that, and it's interesting to see how much you mentally fatigue sooner than you do physically.
Yeah, interesting. That's interesting. I need to go and read that. Steve put some great stuff on there all time. So that's definitely now on my to-read list. Okay, so moving on to efficiency index. And I'll let you talk about the formula for this one, because I made a mess of the last one.
So efficiency index, this was developed by Jim Vance. It's not as good, in my opinion, as the running efficiency, because it doesn't normalize your weight. It's just looking how fast you're going for how much watts. So it's your speed in meters per second over power. So it's your EI. It's not as good as using RE, so I don't really dabble in it too much. But it is one more metric for how much speed you're getting for how much watts you're putting out.
Yeah, and I would say that if you stay at a constant weight and you always compare yourself to yourself, then it doesn't really matter that you don't have, and you can essentially use either one of those, because then in that case, if weight is constant, then either one of them is fine, and you can just choose one and go with it. But of course, since running effectiveness has weight included in it, then that is, in my opinion as well, the slightly more useful metric.
But it is another good number to look at, especially when you're comparing FTP tests. If you're at the same weight, assuming between two FTP tests, you can see, all right, am I getting more speed for the watts that I'm pushing out, instead of just looking at your overall power output.
Yeah, and one more thing to mention: if you have you can have a high efficiency index, but a low running effectiveness, and that can be, like, relatively speaking, even comparing to other runners, and that might mean that your limitation is that you actually need to lose some weight, and you can gain some insights from comparing those two metrics that way. Let's finally talk briefly about form power ratio.
Okay, so form power ratio is the percentage of the power that the percentage of your overall power that's going to, or is going to, not pushing you forward. So it's the founder of Stride said it's your running and pace power. So if you were just running in pace, that would be in place. That would be your power. So it's the percentage of your power that's not going to pushing you forward. And what you want is you want a very low form power percentage, because that means more of your watts are pushing you forward compared to in other directions. So this also allows you to see, when you're doing, as you were saying at the beginning of the show, when you're comparing like an open 10K to a triathlon 10K, you're pushing the same wattage, but you're going slower in the triathlon K. That's because more of your watts are going or in other directions compared to pushing you forward. So the form power allows you to see what happens to your form over time. Is it getting worse, meaning that more of your watts are going to pushing you in other directions besides pushing you forward? Or is it remaining the same or even going down, meaning you're becoming more of your watts are going to pushing you forward and going towards speed rather than lateral or horizontal movements?
Yeah, and this is great. I think form power is a great metric, but again, there has been some confusion in the Facebook group about how to use it, because obviously the higher your weight, the higher your form power is going to be, but that's not the important thing. But when you take the ratio and divide by total power, then you can remove that weight component. So what kind of form power ratios are we usually seeing, or if you can talk about those benchmarks for different kinds of runners?
So it not only varies from different types of runners, but also what pace you're doing. Because at slower paces, your efficiency is going to be lower, so your percentage is going to be higher. So for an average easy run, what I've seen is it's going to be between 29 and 31%. So take the average 30% of your power is going to be is form power. So 30% for an easy run. When you get into marathon pace, it should drop down to about 27, 28%. And then for FTP, you really want it to be between 24 and 26% or lower.
Got it. Okay. So I think that we've covered a lot today, and we'll have everything on the show notes page on thattriathlonshow.com, of course, including a lot of links, resources, and a link to a great Google sheet, a spreadsheet that you can download. So you can just, if you're using Stride, you can plug in your basic numbers and it will calculate all these things for you, the running effectiveness and efficiency index, form power ratio, etc. I have time for just one rapid fire question for you, Chris, because I have the next interview in 2 minutes, and you know the question, so you can decide which question do you want to answer.
I think what's your favorite training tool? I think I'll go with that one.
Okay.
And that's going to be I'm not going to say Stride because that goes without saying. I'm going to say my AeroPress coffee maker, which is, I'm a huge coffee snob and I don't think I could get through a workout without having a coffee beforehand. So I'm going to go with the AeroPress coffee maker. They're not a sponsor of mine as much as I wish they were, but that's my go-to training partner.
Excellent. And if listeners want to find out more about you, you can be found on braveheartcanada.com, and on social media, your handle is trybuddha, and we'll have those links in the show notes as well. And so thank you, Chris. To all the listeners, this has been Chris Hague, again from Braveheart Canada, and myself, Michael Eriksson from Scientific Triathlon, riffing about Stride and running with power. And it was a great pleasure having you on the show, Chris.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
I hope that you found that episode on Stride and running with power valuable. This has been a very requested topic, so I hope that the ones that have been requested it are now happy. And I know that it might seem a bit overwhelming if you are just getting started with running with power or you haven't even tried it, but I think that I'll do my best definitely to, on the show notes page, make this episode maybe slightly clearer than it has been in just from listening to it. Because when you see screenshots and pictures and see these spreadsheets in action that you can then go and access and plug in your own numbers, then it will be so much easier for you, I believe. So go to thattriathlonshow.com and check out the show notes for today's episode to learn more. If you are a member of a triathlon club, or you have friends that you train with, or even endurance athletes that you know, please help me spread the word of the show by telling them and saying that they should have a listen, because there's good content for any endurance athlete. I just recently read a review from a guy that is a time trialist and not a triathlete at all, but he still found this podcast valuable. So do spread the word about this show to any endurance sports friends that you have. That's about it for this episode. On next episode, we will have Matt Dixon, and he is the secret first repeat guest on that triathlon show that I mentioned an episode or two ago. And we will talk about how to train for long course triathlons on a very limited time budget and when life gets in the way. So that is probably something that 70% of the listeners to this show struggle with, and how to deal with training when life happens, which it does. So make sure that you tune in to that episode. Until then, keep sending me emails with feedback and questions to michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. And of course, as always, keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.